Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Moss again here at allpointstv.com, and we're very glad to have you with us this afternoon at 2 o'clock. And we air the program again on WFOV on Friday at 12. And I think that we also air at 12 that morning, Saturday morning. Of course, I'm not up for that program. I'm probably getting half my eat at that point.
That's what he tries to do. If it's like, say, you got a show at 12 o'clock p.m., then he tries to have a 12 o'clock a.m. on the next day. So that's really a big bonus. It's a real good value for those who want to do a radio show of their own. So I'd encourage you to contact Paul Herring if you want to do a radio show broadcast on WFOV, because, I mean, he does a lot of work, and he is reasonable rates, very reasonable, unbelievably reasonable.
John, I want to thank you for saying that, because Paul Harris is doing a great job over there. I want to give a commendation to those at that studio, those who are the technicians over there. You're doing an outstanding job, and your voice is very much needed here in the city of Flint. We were talking last week about something that had been uncovered. I had begun to look at this issue of Watergate in 1974. And I think really before that, because I had read H.R. Haldeman's book in 1967, the book that came out. Haldeman was one of the president's men, one of the chief counselors to Richard Nixon. And he wrote a book in 1967 called The Ends of Power. And he came up with the term, and I think that he might have been the one to use that term publicly in a publication first, called the media the fourth estate. And he was talking about how dangerous they were in terms of having kept Watergate in the press for 2 years, and finally that led to the toppling of the Nixon administration. After having read that book, it began to put my attention on what really might have been going on in Watergate that was not really covered in the media, some things that were going on behind the scenes. And when I came across this article that appeared in Vanity Fair in 1974, an article that was written by one of the Watergate burglars, Eugenio Martinez. And when I read his comments in Vanity Fair, it was really interesting to look at, and I don't think he planned to do this, but to look at what he had uncovered for the readers of what had gone on behind the scenes. And he was just reporting, what was this? This is 74, so it's 2 years after the Watergate break-in that had occurred June 17th of that year, June 17, 1972. And when he was reporting what had gone on from his standpoint from behind the scenes, it just put me on the trail of something was going on here that had not been reported by the press. The press had their report was Richard Nixon ordered the break-in. The burglars went in trying to get some come up on the George McGovern administration, and they gotten caught inside of the Watergate headquarters complex trying to get some dirt on the Democrats so they could run a campaign that would just kind of pretty much run over the Democratic nominee, and they would win the re-election of the president, who had been elected, as you recall, in 1968. That was the kind of public view that was put out, and it looked like that was really the last part, the last word on what occurred in Watergate. But when I began to look at this from another vantage point, from what had been written about in the book by H.R. Haldeman, The Ends of Power, and then read in 74. Let's see. I said that Haldeman's book was in 67. That's not true. It was 77. That book was 3 years after the resignation of Richard Nixon. So Haldeman's book was written in 1977. And having read that, and then having seen the media playing a role in what really was, which led to the toppling of this administration, my first view was that it was for cause, because if Richard Nixon was planning the Watergate, then of course that administration had acted illegally while in office, and therefore his being rooted out of office was in fact something that should have happened based on the fact the president is in the highest office in the land, and there he is in fact engaged in things that were illegal. The break-in the Watergate headquarters was illegal, and if he in fact ordered that, as most of us thought at that time he had done, then his being ruled out of office was in fact holding him to account. But then in 1974, a little bit earlier, I came across, it had been written before Haldeman's book came out, but I had not come across it at that point. But in 1974, which is the same year in which Richard Nixon had resigned his seat, having resigned August 9th, 1974, Vanity Fair had an article by one of the Watergate burglars, and his writing about what had happened inside of Watergate made me begin to look at this through another landscape. The view that I was beginning to come to was that there was more going on here than met the eye based on what had been publicly reported by the two Watergate reporters, the primary ones being Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. And you will recall they wrote a book called All the President's Men. And the movie was made of that later on. I was telling you last time about this movie being made. Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford. And it just looked like that was the end of the story until I came across this article. I did not know this article had been written earlier, but having gotten an older, copy of the Vanity Fair, I began to see that there was something in what Eugenio Martinez, one of the Watergate burglars, had reported that went beyond what had been reported publicly, and there was something else to be added to what we knew from the public understandings that have been given to us by the media and by some of these other things that come out about Watergate. I'll tell you something, it really stunned me last week when I finally came across another source that had documented what I had come up with about 20 years ago, because I saw, in fact, it's been longer than that, I saw back in the 70s that there was something going on here that had not been publicly put on display, that there was another story behind the story. The public story was Richard Nixon had planned the Watergate burglary. But that didn't make any sense, because if he planned the burglary, why would he do that given the poll numbers? The polls had indicated that George McGovern never got out of the 30s. As far as his support among the electorate nationwide, he never got more than 39% of the vote based upon the polls. And when you had the actual election that occurred in November, that election having taken place November the 6th of that year in 1972, Richard Nixon carried every state in the Union except Massachusetts, and carried all the electoral votes in the Union except 14 votes in Massachusetts, 3 votes in the District of Columbia, and there was 1 vote that went to an independent candidate. So there were 17 electoral votes given to George McGovern, 1 electoral vote a third-party candidate received, and Richard Nixon received 520 electoral votes.
Here's a side note, because you might be interested in this. Remember day camp they used to have here in Flint schools, where they used to go during the summer, during the day, they have different activities? Well, anyway, I don't know if you did that.
Cape Copacabana?
No, it was right here in the public schools. I was at Williams School.
All right.
Williams School. Anyway, they had some older kid who was in our class for some reason. He wasn't a helper of the person presenting the class or whatever. But anyway, he was in there, and he had this, he was a typical hippie. He had the long hair and had the army jacket with this American flag upside down on it. And anyway, he was a big McGovern supporter. And he was like 12, he was like 14, 15, 16 years old, closer to voting age than I was. I was like 9 at that point. Anyway, I got thrown out of day camp for that day because I got in an argument with this McGovern supporter. Because I saw, you know how Patrick Buchanan always says he wrote a book right from the beginning, talks about he was always kind of on the right politically from the beginning. I think I was probably more so than he was already at that point, because I couldn't stand McGovern even a child. I thought he was like, I couldn't stand anything he said or stood for. And even he kind of backed up later when he went into business. He started understanding what the negative impact he had on business climate. So he kind of redeemed himself in my eyes, admitting that, because a Democrat seldom admits when they're wrong. But
yeah, and hopefully he set a tone for the people like Ocasio-Cortez, who knows less than what he knew. McGovern was saying what you're saying, John, is that McGovern had made the comment that he was up there in Congress passing all these regulations on business, and he thought he really knew what he was doing as a legislator until he went into business for himself. And then when he found out what the business world really was like, he realized he had made a lot of mistakes when he was a member of the Congress from South Dakota. But that's what you notice with these politicians. They don't have any business experience, most of them, and they're up here passing all these legislative acts and do not know the import of it and what the results will be, and they're passing all this legislation that impedes business. Something else. Go back and listen to Donald Trump's speech that he gave last week in Wisconsin. That whole speech that Donald Trump gave was all about business. That's because that's who Donald Trump is. He's a business person. And you don't have politicians that, when they're giving a rally, a campaign rally, or some rally to kind of get their base energized because we're getting ready for the 2020 election next year, you don't have them talking about business, but Donald Trump's background is business. And that's all he talked about. How the jobs have come back, the businesses have been brought back to the United States, all these things that businessmen would have been involved in and been aware of, and that's what he was talking about. But George McGovern wasn't a business person until after he had served in Congress, and when he got out of the Congress and began to run a business of his own, he realized he had made a lot of mistakes in terms of the legislation they had passed, because all these legislators do is make it hard for businesses to, in fact, grow in this country. And they can't grow, they can't employ anybody. So that's just the nature of the beast. And really the intention of politicians was to keep them on the sideline, make sure everybody's following the laws, but keep them on the sidelines, and let the business persons do the productive work in the country.
I'd like to ask these
limited government.
Like AOC, Ocasio-Cortez. I'd like to ask her this question: If businesses are pernicious and they're always out for their own interest and they're out for making money, why is there the only people, our public servants, quote unquote servants, right, walk away after a few years in office with more millions, they're putting their skin in the game, never having anything to really to lose, except for they go out and do those sound bites and people cheer them on. They go shake hands. I mean, look at the Kildee family here, for example. What have they done really to warrant being in power for so long? Or look at the Dingle family here in Michigan. That to me is an appalling thing. We should be ashamed that we've had this political legacy family being in power for almost 80 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, John, it is really amazing. Some of the problem of our politics in this country belongs in the lap of the American people who are continuing to put these persons in power repeatedly, and the same input, we're receiving the same outcome. And what do you expect? The people that you are putting in power, that we're putting in power in this country, and another thing, the government is not on our side. These politicians are not on our side. And this is not a new phenomenon. This is a historical phenomenon. Going back as far as you want to go back in time, the politicians are acting the same way today as they've always acted. And you can go read any of these books. Probably the best, I won't say the best, but one of the really insightful books would be the one written by the Frenchman named Count Volney, C.F. Volney, Volney, the book called Ruins of Empire. And in that book, he talks about how these politicians have ruined every country they've been over. and the ruins of empire has where Volney, this 1800 writer, the 19th century, but around 1880 something, went to the ruins of all these empires: the Roman Empire, the Syrian Empire, the Persian Empire, Greek Empire, and all these empires in ancient times. All of them had come to ruin. He began to interrogate what had happened to all these ruins. And the short of it is that what happened to them is what's happening right now to countries. The politicians took them over, and that's what they're doing here. And if they're not stopped here, and they're going to have to be stopped, if they're not stopped, they're going to do the same thing here that they've done everywhere else they've been. You saw what they did over there in France, where they made Macron stand down. You know, wearing those vests out there to identify their protests, and just simply stayed out there in the street and made him begin to tap dance to a different tune. He didn't do it voluntarily. What they were telling him is what the founders told King George III. They're not going to take it anymore. We're fed up. We're not going to take it anymore. And until we get to that point in this country right now, with these politicians in Washington, they are going to do the same thing in this country they've done everywhere else they've been. And we make a critical mistake thinking that they're different here than they are anywhere else. Okay, I'm gonna get back to what I'm saying here about Watergate, but we need to understand that these politicians are not different in this country than they are anywhere else in the world. I don't know how we even can mouth these words about Abraham Lincoln, who is put at the top of the scale as the best president we have. I have to tell you this: if Abraham Lincoln is the best they got, if that's the best that they've had in the political arena, and they have him up there as number one, and then based on which historians you talk to and what chart you look at in terms of itemizing our great presidents, as if that's where the greatness is in this country, they always put Roosevelt number 2 on some list, or they put him number 3 on some list. They don't even put George Washington at the top. And this is the person that would have gotten this experiment off the ground. If he had not done what he did, then Lincoln, who they give a lot of credit to as being the greatest president we've created, would never had a chance to do what he did. But Lincoln was not. Look, if you got to put Lincoln up there as the greatest president we've had, and you put him up there at the very top of the icons of this country, first of all, claiming they are icons in this country, when there's only one icon this country has produced as a president, and that's George Washington. The rest of that is just noise being made. Basically, noise has been written by these politicians, these book writers, these high school and middle school history book writers that have to pass through the politicians to get their books in those schools, and that's why they write that this what amounts to noise about these presidents. In fact, like the history books they have in these classrooms is really a history of the politicians. It's not a history of the ones that made this country work or made this country great, because politicians didn't make this country great. What made this country great was its producers. And they've been able to work in the limited space given to them that was not given to countries, given to other persons in other parts of the world. We had more space here for the producers to produce. And as long as that space was there, to a large extent, it's being closed up now. You see that the producing class now is under attack in this country by the politicians. You know, for obvious reasons, they want the influence, and they're not the natural influencers because they don't produce anything. So they want to close the producers down because they are the natural influencers in society, because they're producing products that people want and people need, and they therefore go to them for that because they're servicing a need that everybody in the country wants. What need is being served by these politicians? Noise is basically what they're serving, and regulations and all of these things. But the point I'm trying to make here is that I'm not surprised by the breakdown in government on any level, because that's what politicians do, and they've done it throughout the history of the world. It's not a new phenomenon. And this Watergate burglary, which we said Nixon was the one that most of us believe that Nixon planned it, and I thought that when it first came out, and reading these earlier the writings in the Washington Post, New York Times, which I didn't understand who they were at that time. I didn't know this was fake news. Most of it is fake news, and I took their word for it. But I'm a reader, so I continued to read as they were publishing more and more information. And The Ends of Power by Haldeman kind of woke me up a little bit. And then this article appeared in Vanity Fair really opened my eyes up, because what Eugenia Martinez, one of the burglars, reported was that they thought that this break-in had been covered. They really thought that that this break-in had persons inside that network that were on the same page with them trying to get information on George McGovern. I don't know why you want information on George McGovern, first of all, because George McGovern posed no threat to the reelection of Richard Nixon. And that can be seen by the polls before the election, and when the election was held on November the 6th, what happened on the election day, when Richard Nixon got 520 of the electoral votes. There's only 538 electoral votes today. 520 of them Richard Nixon received. And that was the third largest electoral discrepancy between the two major candidates running for president. There was a third largest gap between the person who won and the person who lost. The third largest gap between the candidates was in 1972. So there's no threat to Richard Nixon. So when I saw the poll numbers and then I was reading these articles, it didn't make any sense for me to continue to contend that Richard Nixon had ordered the break-in. In fact, I now know, having read the documents, that Charles Colson is the one that went and told Richard Nixon there had been a burglary in Watergate. And he said it seems like that some of them were connected to CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President. Richard Nixon, surprised, which many persons were saying was he knew that they were taping in the White House, so he may have been saying that he was surprised because he knew the tape was going on, but he was genuinely surprised by that, because the numbers indicated there was not going to be a very close election in 1972. So then, if it was not Richard Nixon that, in fact, ordered the break-in, the question then comes up, how did that happen? And then I read in Vanity Press, I read about the Watergate burglary from one of the burglars, Eugenia Martinez. And he wrote this article in Vanity Press. I didn't read it when it first came out, but I was beginning to go back into Watergate to look at what happened there, because I knew something had happened there that had not been reported, and I was on to the trail of trying to find out what it was. So I went back to read this article. First I typed in the Watergate burglary, and a lot of things came up. I read all the things that came up over a period of time, months, in some cases years later. And one article that came up long after it had been published was this article written by Eugenia Martinez. It was called Mission Impossible. Eugenia Martinez, there's a comma, Watergate burglar. And so in that article, it says, and this is what alerted me to it, in the article it said that a few days later, this is after the break-in, a few days later, my CEO told me, the company, he's CIA, so his CO, his contact inside of the CIA, a few days later, my CEO told me that the company had no information on Eduardo except that he was not working in the White House. Well, imagine, I knew Eduardo was in the White House. What it meant to me, this is Martinez talking now. What it meant to me was that Eduardo was above them, and either they weren't supposed to know what he was doing, or they didn't want me to talk about Eduardo anymore. And now, before we take the break from WFOV, I will say that Eduardo was, this was the secret name, the hidden name of another person. I'll tell you that on the other side of the break. The person that was that was running it was the person that had gone into the White House and was working in there as a member of CREEP, but was CIA inside of the Nixon administration. We'll hold that until you come back from WFOV. I want to finish it up on the other side of the break. We'll see you in 4 minutes. I'll be telling them when they come back, though, that this person inside of the that organized that break-in, that burglary of Watergate. It came out of the White House, but not from Richard Nixon. It came out of the White House from one of the 3 persons that were arrested in Dealey Plaza when John F. Kennedy was killed. One of the tramps. And when I saw this person that was now inside of the White House ordering the CREEP break-in, the committee to re-elect the president, break-in in Watergate, you can imagine the alarm bells it sent off. Because that person, E. Howard Hunt, and I'll inform WFOV when they come back, Eduardo, which was his name as a secret agent, was E. Howard Hunt. And E. Howard Hunt allegedly is one of the persons that was in the Dealey Plaza in the Grassy Knoll area. And so was another one of the Watergate burglars, Frank Sturgis. So when you begin to connect these dots, as I did, and some others have done, and as this book I came across last Monday, as I got to do some research that morning, it stunned me that there was a book out that had come to the conclusion I came to. I had come to this conclusion some years ago, that there was a person inside the White House that ordered that burglary, and the people thinking that because it came out of the White House, it had been ordered by Richard Nixon. That's why they went ahead with it. In other words, what I'm saying here, and this is now documented in the book called Family Secrets. And in that book, they verify they come to the same conclusion, that this break-in didn't make any sense. And the person inside that break-in, one of them in there, and I will give his name, James McCord. James McCord was in there as a hidden operative in there to betray the other 4. Now, you may not think that they do stuff like that these people that work in our intelligence agencies do not operate that way. Well, go back and look at what happened to Oswald. I was rereading this book last night called Whitewash, written by Harold Weisberg. You don't know that name because that name has not been publicized as much as some of the others. But Harold Weisberg is the first one to begin to break open what happened in Dealey Plaza. He also has a book out called Frame Up about the assassination of Martin Luther King. But in the book Whitewash, Volume 4, because there's 4 volumes to it, in Volume 4, he produced the documents. Showed you the documents that were labeled top secret at first, having fought them in court to get these documents because they were saying that this had to do with national security, which made no sense if Oswald was a single shooter in Dallas. It made no sense for them to have information classified as national security. If it's just a single shooter and there was no conspiracy, why are you classifying the information and not letting the American people read it? Okay, so that was a problem, and he began to sue for the information. Those documents that were top secret at one point have been declassified, and now you can read the documents in Whitewash Volume 4. Okay, we're back. Welcome you back from the break, WFOV. I'm glad you came back, as you always do. And I told you we'll not be very far from where you were when you left. I named the person that was the CIA name of this person was Eduardo, but his name was E. Howard Hunt. And if that doesn't ring a bell, it's because you did not probably see where E. Howard Hunt on his deathbed, and there's a video you can go and watch on YouTube where he confessed to his role in Dealey Plaza. This was an unbelievably well coordinated, well planned, well orchestrated conspiracy to murder a president of the United States, and they covered it up. And if they would do something like that inside of the government of the United States, there's nothing they would not do. And if you go look at the pattern of the Watergate and compare it to the pattern of what occurred in this latest fiasco where they were trying to topple the Trump administration, this was an attempted coup d'etat. And as Donald Trump says, and he's exactly right in it, is that it failed. It was a coup d'etat, but it was an attempted coup d'etat, but they failed in carrying it out. They were trying to, if you want to talk about voter suppression, this was even worse than that. This was an attempted voter disenfranchisement. Can you imagine that? I mean, can you imagine in the last election in 2016, November the 8th, 63 million people went to the poll and voted for Donald Trump against the rulers of this country, who said they didn't have a shot, didn't have any chance of winning the presidency. But the American people knew better. And just because the polls were indicating that Hillary Clinton was going to win in a landslide, some were saying she'd get as many as 404 electoral votes. And don't forget, I just said there were 538 electoral votes. 404 of them that they had said would probably go to Hillary Clinton. They said Donald Trump is going to lose by a landslide. Only to find out on November the 8th, Donald Trump had 306 electoral votes. You only need 270. He had 306 electoral votes. Hillary Clinton had about 232? With some other votes going to some of the others, but very few in the other camps. But the two major contenders, Donald Trump won. If you count the electoral votes, he won in a landslide. And they said he had no shot at it. Although we were saying that that couldn't be true either, because we kept looking at the rallies, and we saw the rallies had these numbers in it at Donald Trump's rallies. Over here where the other candidate, Hillary Clinton, didn't have the same number. She couldn't even fill up a high school gymnasium. So that couldn't have been true. And then so they came up with something to take this man out of power after the election was over. And that didn't make any sense until I began to see back in the time period, go back to Watergate and review it again to see what had happened with Watergate and see something they had not seen before. And that was insurance policy. Because there was no way Richard Nixon could lose that election in 1972. No way. The polls indicated that George McGovern had no shot at winning the presidential election in 1972. It was too much chaos in his campaign, first of all. Don't forget that Thomas Eagleton had been placed on the ticket. And Eagleton's past history, somebody got a hold to his records, his medical records, and had shown he had nervous breakdowns. And that you can't have that. You cannot have that in the public domain and then have that person remain on the ticket. So they had to get him off the ticket, put another person in his place. And that chaos inside of the Democratic campaign further hurt George McGovern's chances. But he wasn't a strong candidate in the first place. The insurance policy, therefore, was what you saw in terms of the Donald Trump election. The insurance policy was Russian collusion. And if they couldn't stop him at the election, November the 8th, 2016, then they were going to stop him in the aftermath of the election, which was the Mueller report, the Mueller investigation, and then this wishy-washy report that he wrote. The first part, wishy-washy language saying that the evidence was not sufficient, that he could not, in fact, bring about a charge, but it could not also exonerate the president. In other words, he couldn't bring the legal challenge to the president's being in office, but he raised the question politically because he knew if he raised it legally, it goes to the legal channels, and then the Watergate issue comes up in terms of what Watergate was in this case. Watergate in this case was the Russian collusion issue there. In other words, the Watergate was the insurance policy in case Richard Nixon won in 1972, and of course he was going to win because all the polls indicated in that case the guy was totally out of it. And then the chaos in his camp was another thing that showed they had no shot. But they didn't know whether or not this was going to be as clear as what they were saying in public. They took out some insurance against it in case he got through, and the insurance was the Russian collusion, which they knew that was in fact a lie. And then after the election was over, then you had this renegade inside of the administration, who I think is now in serious trouble, and that's Rod Rosenstein, and they're getting ready now to turn the tables on the investigators and go into how this happened. How do we have, not that I have a question about it, I know how it happened, because we have another voice in our government that is below the surface of the voting public that we don't see because it's below the veneer of the government. We have another part of the government under the surface is orchestrating policy in the country as well.
See, the government treats us like they always say to each other. It's above your pay grade. Whenever we ask questions about it, that's their attitude. It's above your pay grade. I mean, it's like basically, shut up, little one. Yes. We're here. We're the big players. Screw you. We can do whatever we want.
Along with the program, and if we continue to shut up and go along with the program, I can tell you the end is not going to be to our benefit, because we have the same gangsters in power in our nation capital as they have all over the world. I don't know how we don't do enough. You know, we go to school first of all. So when I say I don't know how we can't see this, I guess I do see it, because I do see why we don't see what's going on. Because after 12 years of them of these schools run by the government, putting this nonsense in front of the students at the early age, getting them in kindergarten and raising them from kindergarten up to 12th grade, and give them a diploma after they finish the indoctrination they've gotten into. I can see why people have a hard time recovering, because most of us are recovering from that.
But no, here's a kicker, though. I mean, and people who aren't aware of your background, you taught in public schools for 39 years.
And I saw it for 39 years.
Okay,
too.
so if you were somebody, say if you were to have kids, say you're a younger person starting out, what advice would you give to younger people right now when they face the situation about having their kids educated? Would you recommend homeschooling or private schools or a combination of, or maybe send them to public schools and actually they have to engage in propagandizing after they get home?
Do the same thing that the Jews did here in Michigan, John. When the Jewish community was not licensed to teach in homeschool because they didn't have the credentials to do so, what they did, they sent the children to the public school, but recognizing, of course, the insufficiency of it, and also their own culture was not being relegated to those classrooms. When they came away from those public schools, they had classes set up in the synagogue, and they taught them additional things from their own institutions.
Well, see, so, I don't know if you were aware of this, but the Presbyterians, this is the old Presbyterians, not these more liberal branches currently in vogue. They had started Sunday school. It wasn't church teaching or Bible teaching. They actually set it up for people to send their kids through school there, so they at least get 1 day a week of of training and education. So I mean, and my parents did that too. Though we had tutors for math because that was a weak area. Math, all the other areas we pretty much did well in, but they paid $10 an hour back in the 70s for a local guy, a neighborhood guy, to teach us more, math skills and to bring us, because we were lagging behind. The teachers did what they could, I guess, but it was something. Some people don't always gravitate and grasp the subject matter. But they paid, and my parents did not make a lot of money. They weren't factory workers. They didn't get the pay that they did. They got significantly lower, but they took it upon themselves, because they saw the inadequacies in the education system and where we weren't meeting the mark as maybe we were poorly functioning. Some people, like I said, subject matters are beyond certain people. They have to be presented a different way. And public schools typically don't engage in that. If you're basic, it's a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah, I think that, John, if we recognize that what is being done in the schools is insufficient to the total education of the child, and it's limited by design. I mean, some of it is, in fact, planned. It's planned. The schools don't operate because they don't intend to have the schools to operate. Because if you teach children how to be competent, then you have a problem with competent people coming out of the schools, and they're now able to see what's going on in society, and accountability is a given. If people can understand the world they live in, and they can see what is being said to them through the media and so on and so forth, and understand how false much of it is, then they will be able to hold persons to account, and accountability is not what politicians want. That's why they took over the public school systems. Go read a book. There's a book out, by the way, that you can read by Napolitano, called Theodore and Woodrow. And that book talks about the beginning of the takeover of the public schools. You should go back and look at how children were being tested at that time, the kind of tests they had at that point. These tests, none of these children coming out of these government schools today can pass that test that they were given back in that time period. Because those tests were very rigorous, and they tested persons having a lot of information that's not being taught in schools right now. But we don't recognize that the schools are insufficient. Therefore, we think the totality of what goes on there is sufficient for the education of the child. That wasn't the idea back in the time period. People educated their children in these home schools, these church schools. And the government saw that was a danger to the status quo. So then the government has taken over more and more of the responsibility of running schools. They require you to go to those schools, or some school, certified school, basically public schools, up until the age of 16. I mean, and I used to say, when I was teaching school, I used to say that children drop out of school in fourth grade. And I said, no, Mr. Smalls, you cannot drop out of school until 16 years of age. And I would say that's when they leave the building. They hold them in the building for another 12 years. Another 8 years, right? Because the students drop out of school after being very excited about going to school. You know how excited kids are when they go into school, because they want to learn how to read, and they want to learn how to read and how to count and how to write. And I know that from having raised some grandchildren and some nieces, and that I used to think they would actually you read them. I read them these children's books, and then after I would read it one or two times to them, they would say, "Let me read it back to you." And I was saying, how are they reading the book, and they haven't gone to school yet? Well, they had not learned to read. They can memorize the book. And so on the page, as I was showing them what I was reading, when they got to that page, they had memorized it. That's how great their minds are. They had memorized what was in the book and was reading it back to me. Not that they were reading the words, but they knew what was on that page. And I was just stunned to see them doing that. And when my grandchildren first went to school, they were out in Grand Blanc. When they first got out there in first grade, the teachers were telling them that they're too far advanced. But what I noticed is that there was a level of retardation going on every year they were in school. And after about grade 6 or so, the fallback was such that you could never have known that when they went to school, they knew their colors, they knew the ABCs, they knew a lot of things they were teaching in grades 1 through 4. Now, you start seeing a kind of a disaffection from the schools, and that's because children drop out of school after a while. They're very excited to get there at the very beginning, but after being there for a period of time, they begin to fall back from it because they become discouraged by what is being put in those classrooms. That C-spot jump stuff just does not get it, and it's intended that way. You heard about those Dick and Jane books. You call them Dick and Jane books when I was coming up, the primary readers. And they would have these words, sentences would be run, 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 C-spot jump, 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 jump. You give children that for 4 years and they're out of there because there's nothing, they're not learning anything.
You know, I got hold of a edition, it was a child's edition of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. And I got so interested in reading, I shot out 12 reading levels almost overnight.
Yeah.
And I was tested when I was because what it was is the teachers noticed I was bored after I started reading that kind of stuff. And I finished with all my work for the how they broke us off into reading segments, and that's what I did. I was so bored with the crap that they were giving us in the books that I just checked out mentally. I could read. I can't remember not be able to read. But it's just the stuff they give us. Like my brain said, you could stay, but I'm leaving. Just walked away. I mean, like did like a Homer Simpson kind of thing, but it's like walked away. It was like I don't care if Dick and Jane run. I don't care if they run. I'm checking out.
Yeah,
So.
John, I had classes in high school, and I'm telling you the absolute truth. That bell would sound, and not one student would move. Because there was something going on a little bit above what and a lot of them would stay after class over and want to talk beyond the point of the class coming to an end anyway. I got into a lot of trouble because students would stay during other teachers' class period, and they would I'd get called to the office because of that, because they knew what I was doing. I was teaching history, and I wasn't teaching history that was in those books. In fact, they called me. I'll tell you this. We're a little bit off what I want to talk about, but I'll tell you this on the QT and running. That I was called over to the superintendent's office in 1971, and the superintendent of school told me what I was going to teach in my classroom, told me, you're going to teach this. And I had just read the book by James Herndon called The Way It's Supposed to Be. And Herndon had said that if you are in the classroom and you're not making happen what's supposed to happen, then that's all right. You're not going to be in trouble. But if you're in the classroom making happen what is not supposed to happen, they say you're doing things outside the box and you're making things happen where children are excited about your classroom, then you are going to be called in, and that's going to be a matter of you getting tenure. And I had run into that. And they called me over and told me, because my students were staying after class over, and the bell would sound, and I had to tell them, you can leave, because they wouldn't move. I'm telling you the truth. And then they come back after school is over. And so I got called over to the superintendent's office, and he told me that you're going to go in your classroom. They called me in on Friday. Told me, you go in your classroom on Monday, and you're going to teach this, this, and this. You know what I told him? And why did I tell him this? Because I was crazy. I'm older now, but I'm about 26, 27 years old at that time. Might have been a little bit younger than that because I finished college and when I was 21, because I got double promoted when I was in school. So I finished high school at 17. So but I'm kind of like idealist. My dad told me you too idealistic. But when he told me you're gonna teach this, and this in your classroom, I told him not me. I said before they get taught in my classroom, you teach it, and before I teach it, I see you in court. And why did I say that? Because I was crazy. I mean, I was single. I mean, we came out, I'm a sixties child, right? So we were kind of like into that mindset of our ideals were first. And we got fired. We were talking about being a martyr for the cause. That's the way we saw it. But I didn't recognize a lot of things then that I recognize now. And I'll tell you from having been in the classroom 36 years in the classroom, 3 years in principalship, is that it's ordered that way. Those tests are ordered to make sure that nothing's taught in those classrooms because the teacher's got to teach the test. And until that ends, you will not have any education of any import going on in those classrooms. And it's intended that way. In fact, you can direct the teacher of what's being taught in the classroom by not doing what the superintendent of schools did to me, telling me you'll go in the classroom and teach this and this. You don't have to do it that way. Just in fact order the test to be given, and they have to teach to the test because that's how you mark whether or not the school is successful or not. So on day one, they start teaching the test. They don't start teaching history; they teach the test, and that's how they rule and so on and so forth. So when you see things going on like what happened to Donald Trump, people don't understand that. When Donald Trump started talking about fake news, talk about an attempted coup, they can't see there's an attempted coup d'etat because it's a reading problem. I say that all the time in my study group. We got a study group that meets once a month. That it's a reading problem that we have in this country. People can't read, and I include in that the scholars, including the ones last week. That's you guys. John Dean. John Dean was one of the president's men under Richard Nixon. John Dean was ridiculing and mocking the president last week because he said that if they impeach him, he's carrying it to the court. And so John Dean called him a nitwit, said that he's a nitwit. And because he was saying, John Dean now was saying that you can't take impeachment to the court. Well, let me tell John Dean something, because he's illiterate too. The issue of that is yes and no. You can't carry impeachment to the court as long as you're talking about impeachment, which is spelled out in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5, and the trial in Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6. But if you talk about impeachment that falls below the threshold of what's required in Article 2, Section 4, and you're trying to use the impeachment process to remove the president, then it does involve the court. And I noticed, John Dean, you didn't say nothing about those persons talking about you have to have a crime in order to bring about impeachment. And you never said anything about that. You never called them nitwits. You're the nitwit, because Donald Trump was at least partially right. You know what I wish would have happened in history? I wish what had happened when they impeached the first president. Who was that, by the way? Because in our readership, in our listenership, we have readers. Andrew Johnson, right? The 17th president of the United States. What I wish had happened with him, I wish they had, just for historical reference points, that they had that other vote, that they fell one vote short of bringing about conviction on impeachment charges. The impeachment charges were not high crimes and misdemeanors. They didn't rise to the level of the requirement in Article 2, Section 4, which says the president, vice president, and all civil officers of the United States, which I showed you before, that does not include the members of the House and Senate, because they're not civil officers of the United States, they're civil officers of the states that they're elected from. I showed that, and other scholars have shown that, because they can't read either. We got a reading problem in the country. If you didn't have a reading problem, they couldn't get away with what they get away with in Washington, because 3/4 of what they do in Washington is unconstitutional. This stuff that they're doing in Washington right now is unconstitutional. The authorization for what Congress does is spelled out in Article 1, Section 8. In the itemization called the delegation of powers, the enumeration of powers in the Constitution. And what they're doing, I heard a person this morning talking about running upon on their vision of what they can do to lead the country. Nobody asked them to lead the country. That's not the job of politicians to lead anything. Their job is to do that which is prescribed to them in the Constitution. And they're talking about they want to do Medicare for the whole for the whole population. They want to give everybody Medicare, and then say it's free, meaning that they're not going to pay for it. Yet nobody's working free, right? So this is what none of this is authorized by the Constitution. And if we could read, we could then understand that outside of the Constitution, we'd understand the Constitution is in exile. This book right here by Napolitano, and we'd be able to hold them account. They don't intend to have anything in the classroom to teach anybody any skills, because then we know how off the wall these politicians are, and they're out of here. Well, I got to get out of here myself because I've always extended my welcome today. And so we are now beyond our time. But I'm going to pick this up again next week in terms of what's going on here with this latest Watergate we have with the Donald Trump administration, because they're doing the same thing now they did to Richard Nixon. It just didn't work this time. Okay, we out of here. Until next week, I want you to follow your dream. If you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.